So I've talked about desire a lot before, and it continually fascinates me, and I continually get new kind of insights and understanding into why, like every misunderstanding or sort of like tension we have, or feeling that something isn't right or isn't enough, is essentially with enlightenment like what we're trying to diffuse and see beyond. And yet it's also pointing us it's like a guidance that's pointing us to what we want. So it both like is the thing that we want to get rid of, as well as the thing we want at the same exact time, which seems mind-blowing. But of course, non-duality like to sort of feel and understand non-duality is just like a mind-blowing thing, because all the mind can do is speak in duality, and yet it creates. Duality is creation. Duality is the separate colors of the rainbow, of the shapes that create everything. If there's life, then there's death, and if there's focus, which is what you truly are, then there's distraction. But in order for you to know distraction, you have to be focused on it. So essentially, there's only really focus. And essentially, there's only really life, in the same way that there's no life without death. Because you have to be alive to know what death is. So it's really pretty amazing. But there's a sort of practical kind of thing with desires that I've become aware of that I wanted to talk about. And so we often like hear desire spoken about in like a way of that you need to get rid of it. And like I just sort of explained, the incredible paradox of enlightenment, of getting rid of those tensions. We often, when we speak of desire that way, we're often sort of thinking about like typical desires, like desires for relationships or desires for material things or whatever. And so, like earlier on the path, or sometimes we judge other people as having like these unconscious desires. But all of those things are too truly pointing you to something. It just gets further and further refined. And so, what happens when we start to see through some of these desires, or we start to get them and start to see how we're unfulfilled by them, we have this like deeper yearning for something deeper, and we start having these like spiritual desires, and desires for awakening, and desires for understanding, and desires for a more peaceful sense of being, or being more present, or something like that. Um, and so we see through this. We kind of intellectually like see through all these other things. And yet that can sometimes be a problem, because we see through it and then create a separating ourselves off from these lesser desires, which were always pointing us to. So we start to equate these lesser things with suffering, when in reality they're all part of creation. And when you get down to it, you can never actually own anything. Like they talk about like you're born with nothing and you can't take anything with you. But like in my last video talking about, that's already the case. You only experience things, even if you even if the government says that you own this piece of land or whatever, you essentially only can experience it in the moment. And so, like, when we start to understand that, it starts to not be a problem to avoid things as much. And we also realize that there are these much like deeper desires that are still like beyond the desire for enlightenment or the desire to be beyond all desires, which gets you into trouble. But that sometimes like what we seek to find in a romantic relationship, we want also to have like what's called agape and have this sort of like amazingly deep and uninhibited relationship with anyone that we meet. And that is sometimes misconstrued to be um, like free love or something like that, which is like this common kind of thing, but it's not. It doesn't even have to look a certain way or anything. And it's funny because I was journaling about this, and there's this amazing non-dual scene in the Gospel of Thomas where Jesus says, when you make the man into the woman and you make a hand where a hand is, and etc. Sometimes we like look in a romantic relationship for that resolution, when in reality it's already like experientially the same. In the moment it's the same thing outside of a thought of I am a woman and you are a man, or you are also a woman, or whatever. You're experiencing what you're experiencing with no boundaries. And so like that kind of deep desire sometimes has to be that's an example of how sometimes those things have to be experienced to show us the like that that's not really it, that it's kind of going deeper. And so many of our desires that we end up having as adults are kind of like cop outs. Like we have been so forgotten like our own inner resonance with things, and this is one of the most amazing things that I've experienced, is how fascinating things become the more that I am able to focus and let go of thoughts. And the more you start to understand about this, like this is like coming into the root of everything. And so you start to see things anywhere. And you start to also like know where to find things that you are going to resonate with. It's just an amazing thing. But we came here to create. And so when we start to like use the mind to be like, okay, this kind of car, this kind of lifestyle, this kind of partner is what I see other people enjoying. So this is what I'm going to enjoy too. We lose the freedom to create, and we lose that connection with what it is that we truly enjoy and desire. And when you have desire for the thing that you are experiencing exactly in this moment, there is no resistance whatsoever, which is why desire is completely key, and which is why a true desire is simply like the feeling of already having something. And like I said, you're gonna experientially, you already have what you want, is to want this moment like fully and completely. So, as far as I can whittle it down to the core desire that I have, I want to be free of like the tensions that I feel in my body and the thoughts that sometimes arise as like a tension, and yet wanting the absence of something that's already not happening. It's already the case, and yet like that, like I said at the start, the magic of the feeling that something isn't quite right here is also exactly what we're trying to dissolve. So we're kind of stuck. Like, what am I going to do? What am I supposed to do with this? And so this is why you go about life. And if you want to buy something, or you want to experience something, or you want to have an ice cream, you have an ice cream. And sometimes it's almost like it's a scavenger hunt. Like, the material isn't really the material, and locations aren't really locations, and yet this is sort of all the magic of it. And so sometimes you get like a desire or an impulse to do something that seems completely unrelated to what it is you really want. And yet it somehow, like, magically, inexplicably brings you closer to it. And we I think that sometimes we're smart. We see through this whole game. So we're trying to, like, sit there and not really play it, kind of missing that what we really want is to play and fully enjoy it, because non-duality, there's no end to this. This is never going to be done. So there's a lot to create along the way. Oh. So I forgot this funny thing that I, like, had an insight as I was just walking out here, that like with my awakening, it was kind of like everything I wanted but never dreamed was possible all of a sudden, like, landed in my lap. But there was also this kind of, like, funny joke kind of essence to it too, because, like, two of the things that were sort of like permanent realizations were that death isn't real, that I can't really die, and that this is all imagination, and, like, I can purely retrieve my childhood, like, imagination and that kind of, like, sense of fantasy and belief in fairy tales and everything, which means that I can still imagine death. So you're kind of, like, right back around to where you started. But there is this, like, incredible sort of, like, desire is sort of like the pull and the thing that's pulling at the same time. So when you see through the fear of death, and you see through trying to decide what you want and think about what you want, forgetting that wanting is a feeling that can only happen right now, that can only be a resonance for a thought or an experience right now, then you find that your desires drastically change. And you may find that it is helpful just not to want things for a while, because you don't actually know what you really want, and it takes time to connect with that feeling. And if you think about it, like, all feelings really are a desire. Pain is a desire for attention. Like, pain is a guidance system. We wouldn't know not to do stupid things with our bodies if we didn't have pain. And so feelings are the same thing. They're a guidance system, and suffering is a guidance system telling you that you're not thinking about something in a way that is with creation, in a way that is with duality being two and not two at the same time, which creation is the whole point of. And I do this because that tree behind me is the tree I saw where I got the insight that the two and the one are the same thing. It was when that, like, hit me. But you cannot, you can't even set, like, non is not two. You can't separate it out. And so you can't separate you from the desire, and you can't separate the desire, the not having um, from the having. And so essentially, like, you can't actually have anything because it's an experience. Like I said, you can't own the land, you can only experience it. So you see how desire kind of gets you could create a whole new teaching called non-desire. And it'd be all about talking all about desire. And that's sort of what non-duality is. It's sort of like the understanding of like, oh, that's what duality is for. And suddenly, instead of trying to like secure yourself or keep yourself alive, you realize that you're like creating the whole game. So what do you want to create? Like, what? That's where it gets really interesting, where you start to see the freedom and like kind of find yourself like falling back into different ways, and maybe using like spirituality and types of guidance as like what I should want. I should want to meditate for 60 minutes every morning, or I should want to have this spiritual retreat experience or something. But really, like this freedom to really like don't look at those people, and we immerse ourselves in these communities because we want this influence of people. But really there's no difference between them and anybody else, and we can use them the same way that we used we looked at other people in high school, and we looked at the popular kids in high school, and maybe fell into the trap of thinking that what they had and their apparent happiness meant that those things actually brought happiness. And again, you're way more free than that. And so, like, spirituality, the same thing. Spiritual experience is the same thing. What do you really want in this moment? Because wanting is not a thought, and you can write all those thoughts down that come out of wanting, and maybe they resonate with you, and maybe they no longer resonate with you. And so, like, realizing the feeling of desire is also realizing that desire is a feeling, and that nothing else, that it's not a thought, also is the freedom to completely drop a desire as well, which is that the way out of desiring to not have desires.